Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Today's episode, the gun show. There's a mass shooting in the United States roughly every 2 months. Yet one group, above all others, insists guns aren't to blame. And that group is the NRA. We're taking a hard look at what they really stand for. We're also looking at their political firepower, the money, the attack ads, and why politicians are so scared of them. And finally, is America now at a turning point? Can grief-stricken teenagers win their showdown with the NRA? All that and more coming up right now in the Nexus. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore, and today in the Nexus we are stripping down the world's most powerful gun lobby. And I'll have help from Pardeep Kaleka. Now, his father was killed in a mass shooting in 2012. He now campaigns for stricter gun controls. The former Marine, Kyleanne Hunter, is also joining us. She will tell us why she left the NRA. And Professor Kevin Yuill. Now, he just published a book on the Second Amendment. He argues the NRA is actually being unfairly targeted. So now we're all together. Let's watch our first report on a group that's said to have politicians shaking in their boots, the NRA.
To stop a bad guy with a gun, it takes a good guy with a gun. Thank you very much. We stand ready and resolved to defend our freedom and secure our safety against any enemy. Terror knows no more ferocious foe than freedom in the hands of we the people.
The NRA always says, well, changing the laws won't stop all of the killings. I think if we stop any of the killings by changing the laws, that's a big step forward.
But the NRA says no, so Republicans do nothing.
People say, well, what am I going to say to the NRA? I got a question for you. What are you going to say to those parents?
The left's message is absolutely clear. They want revenge. You've got to be punished. They say you're what's wrong with America, and now you've got to be purged.
And the violence begins with the NRA stating the true facts that they are the perpetrators of the crimes that are taking place in our schools.
They have put millions and millions of dollars into working against reasonable gun laws.
If a child can't open a bottle of aspirin, we should make sure that they can't pull a trigger on a gun.
The Second Amendment is one area where the Obama administration has run into a wall. And that wall is the Kevlar-covered wall of the NRA.
It becomes a marketing issue for the NRA and the gun lobby because they can sell more guns if they can sell fear.
In this uncertain world, surrounded by lies and corruption, everywhere you look, there is no greater freedom than the right to survive and protect our families with all the rifles, shotguns, and handguns we want.
When it comes to the Second Amendment, I never ever vote for a candidate, whether it be local, state, or federal, who doesn't agree with my rights.
These are great people, these are great patriots, they love our country, but that doesn't mean we have to agree on everything. I don't want mentally ill people to be having guns. I think it would be a very positive thing in terms of background checks. It doesn't make sense that I have to wait till I'm 21 to get a handgun, but I can get this weapon at 18. I don't know. So I was just curious as to what you did in your bill. You don't address it?
We didn't address it, Mr. President. Look, I think
you know why? Because you're afraid of the NRA, right?
Well, you're afraid of the NRA, and that comes from Donald Trump. We're going to get into that a lot more in a moment. But first, let's go to the ex-Marine, ex-NRA member, Kyleanne Hunter. Kyleanne, we heard from Wayne LaPierre there. He's the boss of the NRA, essentially, about what the NRA stands for. What do you think the NRA stands for?
Well, so today the NRA stands for fear. It stands for using fear to sell weapons. It stands for trying to divide America even more than it is. It has become a conservative-focused group. It doesn't care about the rights of all Americans, only the rights of Americans who fit a very certain political ideology.
Are they ideologically driven, or are they financially driven, essentially a business?
I think a little bit of both. And I think their ideology and their finances feed into each other. they are ideologically driven by fear-mongering around the Second Amendment, and that is to bolster their financial support.
Okay. Let's examine the
gun
Second Amendment here for our viewers who aren't familiar with it. Let's bring up a quick graphic here defining it. So here we go. This is the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Let's go to the Professor of American Studies now, Kevin Yuill. Kevin Yuill, is that what the Second Amendment was for? And is it still being, are we still true to that Second Amendment?
This is actually taken from the British Constitution, an unwritten constitution, which guaranteed the right of all Britons, as long as they were Protestant, to bear arms in 1689. So this is a very old right. It's been eroded in Europe. It's been eroded in Britain, where it came from. In the United States, it still stands.
When they signed the Second Amendment, do you think they had in mind the enormous proliferation? Let's take a look at how many guns there are in the United States. The enormous proliferation of guns. Take a look at this. There's the United States made up in a sort of by gun shapes. And you can see there, US gun ownership, estimated 300 million weapons, probably more if we imagine the unregulated section of the market. And the US population is only 321 million, so a gun nearly for every single person. Is that what the Second Amendment wanted to guarantee?
It wanted to guarantee protection against tyranny, and it was the seizure of weapons that happens in a tyranny that the United States Constitution was designed to stop. Same as the First Amendment is guaranteed to stop tyranny from censoring Americans.
But Kevin, I mean, we have a picture here of, well, a drawing, if you like, of the Second Amendment being signed. And, you know, it's quite clear people don't dress like that anymore. And the risk of tyranny, that also seems an archaic principle.
Well, you can say that. Number one, guns have not changed that much in that many years. You take a look at the Second Amendment as compared to the First Amendment. The First Amendment has to deal with, for instance, the internet. It has to deal with television and radio and all sorts of different sorts of media, whereas guns generally throw lead in the same way that they did 300 years ago.
I don't know about that. Kyleanne, you're a bit of a weapons expert. You fired a few guns in your time. You know, you go from muskets and, you know, single-shot rifles to what we have now. What do you think?
I think weapons themselves have changed drastically. I mean, weapons themselves have changed drastically in my lifetimes. The guns that I grew up shooting with my family are not the same as the guns that you can buy today, you know, at most any sporting goods store.
Pardeep, let's come to you, Pardeep. Your father was tragically killed in a mass shooting. Do you think the Second Amendment is still relevant today?
No, and I think you're in denial if you're saying that they still throw lead. I have guns. I have more than 10 guns. I have automatic weapons. I've been a police officer, and I know that what they do now is they throw a lot of lead at very high rates of speed. So. You know, when we're talking about tyranny, we're talking about the NRA, and we're talking about how people are psychologically affected by gun violence. And that's one of the arguments we're not having.
But let's talk about gun controls. Well, that's what you're campaigning for. We've got a little graphic here that shows that pretty much in the United States, across the states, I mean, there are some variations. You have to be 18 to get a rifle, 21 years of age to get a handgun. And as far as exclusions go, not that many, really. Here we go. Let's have a quick list here. People who can't buy a gun. If you have a history of drug and alcohol abuse, convicted of gun-related crimes, convicted of juvenile offences, or you suffered from a mental illness. Now, Pradeep, it's interesting. You're arguing for stricter gun controls, but in the case, for example, of the mass shooting in which your father was killed, this man bought a gun quite legally, and none of these, no further gun controls that are being proposed would have prevented that.
No, I mean, he bought the gun. He was a known white supremacist, and he bought the gun 8 days before he committed the shooting. So with that said, no mental health kind of restriction would have done that. And as a mental health practitioner, we would have to violate all kinds of HIPAA laws and things like that to basically get around confidentiality. So, I mean, as far as that goes, there needs to be information sharing. There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
What's the key gun control that you would like to see come in, then? Is it background checks?
It's thorough background checks, yeah, and all gun purchases, meaning that, like, you can't purchase from private parties or gun shows.
Now that's the key thing, isn't it? Because you can buy a gun from another private owner And no background checks are conducted at all?
No, I mean, it's pretty much anybody can be a small arms dealer.
Okay. Let's go back to Professor Kevin Yuill now. We were talking about politicians being afraid of the NRA. Do you think that's a fair depiction?
No, I mean, the National Rifle Association isn't actually in the top 50 spenders on lobbying as far as the figures that I have looked at is concerned. So I don't think the National Rifle Association is in the pockets, or that people are in the pockets of the National Rifle Association in the way it's actually shown. And also, if you break down the figures, there's a lot of money that they're talking about that is included in that 30 million figure that is, for instance, on
30 million that relates to Donald Trump, you mean?
I mean, the figure I've got on direct lobbying is 5,122,000 for 2017. If we look at, for instance, gun lobbyists against the NRA for gun control, then we have about 2 million or just under 2 million. So we're talking about amounts like that, whereas, you know, it's nothing compared to what Facebook, Google, Amazon, all of these come and lobby with a lot more money.
Well, let's get to the lobbying and to the money, okay? So whether the NRA can scare politicians may be a matter of opinion, but clearly they can influence them. That's the whole point of the NRA. So how do they do it? Time to look at their political firepower.
The NRA is loaded, with revenues of $433 million in 2016 alone. Most of its money comes from two sources: contributions, including from gun makers, and membership fees, 5 million members paying around $40 each. The third biggest source of revenue is selling shooting courses and programs.
From my cold, dead hands.
So what does it do with all that money? Well, most of it goes on NRA initiatives, spending on things like gun safety and training programs, annual meetings, cartoons, making sure they reach the next generation of Americans.
My mom always told me that I should never touch a gun if I find one.
But they also want to reach politicians, and do so very successfully. They give money directly to candidates through their Political Action Committee, known as their Political Victory Fund, funded by ordinary Americans donating a few dollars each. Now, a quick look through their filings show who they backed for Congress in 2016. 1% went to Democrats, 99% of their funding went to Republican candidates. For example, Marco Rubio.
The influence of these groups comes not from money. The influence comes from the millions of people that agree with the agenda.
Well, come on, it is the money too. The NRA gave him $9,900 directly, just $100 shy of the maximum allowed, and separately, all by themselves, they spent $1 million on a campaign in favor of him, and over $2 million trashing his opponent. That's nothing compared to the $30 million to help Donald Trump in 2016. $11 million promoting him, $19 million attacking his opponent.
I will not let you down. Remember that. I will not let you down.
We can't go on like this, my friends.
They picked a winner there. Another powerful weapon in the NRA arsenal is their lobbying group, the Institute for Legislative Action, or ILA.
It's headed by the veteran lobbyist Chris Cox.
I'm officially announcing the NRA's endorsement of Donald Trump for president.
Now, the ILA receives millions from corporations including gun makers Smith & Wesson and Ruger. It can't give directly to the candidates, but it can lobby the hell out of them, spending nearly $1 million in the final 3 months of last year alone. So, that's where all the money goes, maintaining its 5 million strong membership, making sure their favorite politicians are elected, and constantly lobbying them once they are. No wonder gun control legislation is so hard to pass.
Once again, the gun lobby is resisting with all its might. Once again, we're battling not just for the safety of our families, but for the soundness of our democracy.
Okay, let's focus on the power of campaigning now and go back to Kyleanne. Kyleanne, the federal law means that the NRA cannot donate more than $10,000 per election cycle to a candidate. $5,000 for the primaries, $5,000 for the election itself. But you can circumvent that quite easily by spending millions on supporting that candidate or attacking his opponent. Just explain that for our viewers who don't know much about American politics.
Yeah, so American politics in a nutshell, unlike European politics, are all fueled by money and special interest on all sides. But I think something that's unique is the ability of these, political action groups, PACs as they're called frequently, to run ads, that are technically independent of the candidate. So the examples from Marco Rubio and Donald Trump that were heard there. So that rather than giving direct donations to to the candidate for their campaign, they run ads that evoke emotions that will then endorse different candidates. And I think that's where a lot of their power is, their ability to make these very well produced ads that really evoke fear and emotions.
We're going to get into those ads in a moment. Professor Kevin Yuill, if I can just ask you, I'm sure you'll argue that the NRA is just playing its part in democracy like every other lobby group.
Yes, I think that's the case. I think I quite like the American system of whereby you are allowed to attack other candidates, and you get a lot more discussion happening around elections. From the United States, I'm sure it appears very, very excessive. I know when I was in the States for an election contest, you got very sick of those adverts. But I think it's a mark of freedom that you are allowed to basically broadcast your views if you want to, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
Oh, let's go back to Pardeep for a moment. Pardeep, you heard there Donald Trump saying, you've heard him in other areas as well, saying, you're afraid of the NRA. I don't have that problem. But he was supported with $30 million of their money. I mean, how do you feel when you watch that sort of remark?
It's disheartening. It's disheartening to say that that the fear is still running this country, and then the conversations that we still need to have as survivors is just traumatic. I don't see any survivors coming out and saying, "Hey, let me work for the NRA and have more guns out in the streets."
Okay, Pradeep, thank you for that. Well, Kyleanne mentioned the attack ads. Now, a lot of the money does, of course, go into attack ads, and we've pulled together 3 little clips for you. See which one is the spoof ad.
You have a right to protect your home with a firearm, but Liberal politician Jason Kander voted against your right.
Dick Lugar has changed. He's become the only Republican candidate in Indiana with an F rating from the NRA.
And Quist doesn't support our gun rights. He said,
I fully support Second Amendment rights.
But he got caught pushing gun control. He even said we should be forced to register our guns. We just can't trust Rob Quist. Defend freedom. Reject Rob Quist. The NRA Political Victory Fund is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Well, which one of those did we make up? None of them. They were all real ads. Pradeep, if I can come back to you, I'm sorry, but they do try to terrify people.
They do, yeah. And that's the whole part of it, is that we don't understand how psychologically damaging that is. I mean, as of like the last week, the NRA has come out with more ads, sort of just like those, basically saying that we are the biggest victim in the world and are, we're lobbying for those that can't defend themselves and they need a firearm. And that's the type of fear that you hear online all the time.
Pradeep, you used to be a police officer for 5 years. You used to attend emergency situations where there were firearms and so on. But you still think that these ads are scaremongering?
They are. They are scaremongering. And I think, we talked about the 300 million guns that are out there. We also have 300 million cell phone devices in the United States. So put those two together and you are conjuring up paranoia.
Professor Kevin Yuill, there's no doubt, these are designed to frighten people, make them think about the safety of their families and so on, but are they also misleading about the candidates that they're attacking? Are they misrepresenting their positions?
Well, where I quite agree with the last speaker is that they are based on fear, but I think both sides of the whole question are based on fear and based on they're not based on statistical analysis or rationality. Both sides are based on fear, as I say in my book. It's an insecurity that stalks America that makes people want to have guns and makes people want to take away guns from other people. And I think those two forces are what are acting in the United States.
Let me get some pictures up here of a certain gentleman called Chris Cox and the president and Wayne LaPierre. Now, the gentleman on the left there, he is the head of the lobbying arm. Now, if their lobbying wasn't so successful, surely the stricter gun controls would be in place by now, because something like 90% of Americans want background checks to be tightened up. Kyleanne?
Yeah, I think this does show, there's 2 things it shows. One, that their lobby strong financially, but more importantly, it shows the psychological power of the fear that they're able to have on politicians, because the politicians aren't supporting what the vast majority of Americans want. They're supporting what the NRA wants, which are often two very different things, with the case of expanded background checks. If you go to the NRA's Institute for Legislative Affairs, one of their top priorities is not expanding background checks. And they point blank say that on their page, despite the fact that over 90% of Americans think that expanding background checks and ensuring that third-party gun sales don't happen is a good thing.
Okay,
and so,
Kyleanne, thank you for that.
Yes.
We're going to come back to you in a moment. It is incredible to see the NRA-backed Donald Trump talking about improving gun controls in the way he has. But perhaps something's changed after the mass shooting in Florida last month. 17 people were killed on Valentine's Day at a high school by a former student. So has America now finally reached a turning point?
Heartbreaking day in Florida, and sadly an all too familiar one. 17 people are now confirmed dead.
A gunman, a former student, opened fire yesterday again.
Again. Yeah. It's happened again. People keep asking us, what about the Stoneman Douglas shooting is going to be different? Because this has happened before and change hasn't come.
In the wake of the Parkland school shooting, teenage survivors of the attack are pressing lawmakers to make changes to gun laws.
If the president wants to come up to me and tell me to my face that it was a terrible tragedy and how it should never have happened, and maintain telling us how nothing is going to be done about it, I'm going to happily ask him how much money he received from the National Rifle Association.
Some of our policymakers and some people need to look in the mirror and take some action, because ideas are great, but without action, ideas stay ideas and children die.
The only way that I can know for sure that this gun will never hurt anyone is if it doesn't exist.
I'm a firm believer in the Second Amendment, and I even have it tattooed on my arm. There's so many of them out there. Well, now, there's one less.
Delta Airlines is the latest company to cut ties with the NRA.
They're joining a growing list here of companies severing ties with the gun rights group.
A growing number of companies are breaking up with the NRA because their customers demand it.
The tide has indeed turned. People who care about this have as much ability to reach out as the companies and the politicians. This is going to be very different this time. Mark my words.
Well, is America at a turning point? Let's go to our panel once again for some final thoughts. Professor Kevin Yuill, we'll start with you. You know, you've just written this book, The Second Amendment. You've spent a lot of time studying this. Do you think America is now ready for change?
I don't actually think it will. I do think it's changed in certain ways. I do think these young people have sort of stirred things up. But I don't think in the end that most Americans are in favor of gun control, at least in a way that's actually going to change the Second Amendment of the Constitution, because that's the only real way to do it.
Disassociate themselves with the NRA?
I think people have done that, but I think that's also a campaign of fear just as much as the NRA conducts a campaign of fear.
Kyleanne, we'll let that point go. We need to ask you about change. Is America ready to change now?
I think they are. And I think being, as a professor myself, and being on a college campus in America right now, and seeing the change, seeing how students are energized in different ways. And these are voters. These are young voters that are pushing for this change. And so I think we're absolutely at a point where if it's going to happen, it's going to happen now.
And do you think the financial costs to businesses of being associated with the NRA are now are now too great?
It's going that direction. I don't know if we're at the actual tipping point now, but it's definitely moving that way, with the cost of businesses for being associated with the NRA is going to be unprofitable.
And Pardeep Kaleka, you spend much of your life now giving therapy to people who have suffered similar incidents as yourselves. You must be hoping, of course, that it's time for change, but do you see evidence that change is coming?
I do. I see a lot of evidence and I think it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. I think the professor sort of represents the old guard of thinking as far as like where we were before.
What is it specifically that gives you hope?
these children. These kids are I mean, they're inspired. They know they've grown up in this for their entire life. They've been part of the internet generation their entire life. So that this is what they know. That change is happening already.
Pradeep, thank you very much for that. Well, we'll see. In the meantime, the cynics and the satirists continue to be skeptical.
Don't worry, Mike. I met with the NRA. They gave me 30 million good reasons not to change a thing. So, cha-ching, it's all good. But the youth of America deserve to feel safe and secure in their schools because, folks, I can only run into so many schools and save everybody.
Always good impression from Alec Baldwin. Well, that's it for this week. Just want to thank our guests, Professor Kevin Yuill, Kyleanne Hunter, and Pardeep Kaleka. Thank you all so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Well, next week, we're looking at the bear-hugging, yoga-loving PM taking India to the next level. See you then. Thanks for watching.